Welcome to this episode of Toward Life 3.0, our ongoing webinar series here at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And we are doing this webinar series Toward Life 3.0 in co-sponsorship with the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Ash Center, also here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm delighted to be co-moderating, co-hosting this again with Sarah Hubbard, who is a senior fellow in that very Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. Many of you will have been with this series before, have known the series for a while. Let me just briefly recapitulate what the series does. So we have named this Toward Life 3.0 after Max Tegmark's wonderful book with this phrase Life 3.0 in it. Life 3.0 is a form of life in which the entities, or at least which some of the entities that populate it, determine both the physical shape they're in and the learning behavior that they are practicing, so very different from the kind of thing that's been going on in previous life forms. One way of getting into something like Life 3.0 would be through an intelligence explosion. This is a series that is devoted to the ethical and human rights related challenges that would occur in the process of getting to something like that. Obviously, we do not know whether anything like that will happen, and then exactly what the shape is in which it will happen. And that is why the ethical and human rights related challenges that the series explores are basically everything that is happening right now. Also in this in an era very much shaped by technological innovation, and there's definitely a whole lot of ethics and human rights related challenges upon us already that are preoccupying us quite considerably, regardless of whether there will ever be anything like a Life 3.0 in Max Tegmark's sense. So that's the general intent and motivation for the series today. We are delighted to have with us today my colleague LaTanya Sweeney, who will be talking about the topic of her talk is technology and the public interest. Before turning over to her, let me just say a few words introducing LaTanya Sweeney to you. LaTanya is the Daniel Paul Professor of the Practice of Government and Technology at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she has a bit of a complicated life here at Harvard. She is also in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences and one of the faculty deans of Curio House here at Harvard University. And she has long been a very well-known figure in the field, aptly described as technology and the public interest. Among other things, she is the director and the founder of the Public Interest Tech Lab, which is also based both at the Kennedy School and in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which develops technologies that protect individual rights and improve people's lives. Among its products, so I encourage all of you to check out their website. So again, it's the Public Interest Tech Lab, a fascinating project. Among their products are the My Data Can, which is a platform that gives people the opportunity to control their personal data from apps and web services. Then they have VoteFlare, an app that monitors a person's voter registration and alerts them if attention is needed. And they have SameSource, which is a platform that allows users like journalists, government officials, and researchers to register and verify the authenticity of original media content, and thereby detect also any modifications such as deepfakes or cheapfakes through automated comparisons. So really very hands-on stuff that is designed to actually make sure that technology contributes to the public interest rather than just to the interest of certain private actors. Professor Sweeney is also the former Chief Technology Officer at the US Federal Trade Commission. She has received numerous awards, holds several patents, and back in 2001, she was the first Black woman to receive a PhD in computer science from MIT in that field. So we are very honored to have Professor Sweeney with us today. Welcome, LaTanya, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the welcome, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with you today. I am going to pull up some slides, so just give me 1 second here to get that up, and we'll get started. Great. I think you can see them now. If not, I'm sure you will come back on and let me know that they're not there. All right, cool. So when we think about technology and the public interest, one of the things we have to realize is where are we in time in history? And we are in the middle of the third industrial revolution. And pretty much everything that we think of and we take for granted, like electricity and cars and even Kleenex, all came from the second industrial revolution. But this revolution that we're on right now is moving at a rapid pace. And many historians put it at a start date in the 1950s with the invention of the semiconductor. And it's now moved on with revolutions within revolutions. What I want to talk to you today about is how this new technological revolution has changed every aspect of our life and has moved us even from a notion of a democracy towards a new definition of what I would call a technocracy. And the real question then is, how do we get back? This is what a camera looked like. At the time, American jurisprudence were going to determine what were the rules for photographing people in public. And after a decade or so of deliberations and lawsuits and so forth, it was determined that it's okay to photograph people in public without their consent. And this is what a telephone looked like. At the time, American jurisprudence was trying to wrestle with what were going to be the rules for recording people's conversation. And again, after decades of deliberations and lawsuits and other considerations, it was decided that you needed consent to record a person's conversation. And depending on your state, what state you're in here in the United States, whether you need one person's consent or everyone on the call's consent. And then in 1984, this device came out. And as my hair is getting grayer, I was around when this came out, but most of my students were. They have no idea what that is. For those of you who may have a few gray hairs, you may recall, this is the Sony camcorder. It was a huge device that fit on your shoulder. It plunged out for about 12 inches. You had to balance it. You had to use the other hand to do the focusing. Took a bit of coordination. But even it was the first device that was battery operated that recorded and showed video, recording both video and sound. And it was a tremendous success right away. People forked over about $1,000 in 1984 money to take home videos and so forth. And in the middle of this success, the manager who was responsible for it, Minoru Morio, calls in his chief designer, Yuji Morimiya, and he says, the thing is just too big. I need something that'll fit in the palm of my hand, and I need it in 18 months. Well, this is like crazy talk. How can you possibly, it's not like you can just shrink everything down. If you did, the current would be so strong it would burn your hand just to hold it. They didn't even have microphones that could capture reasonable sound that would be small enough. Still, Sony forked over tons of resources. The 18-month deadline came and went without the product. But a few months later, this is what showed up. And it looks pretty much like the Sony camcorder of today. It was a tremendous success. And the first advertisements for it actually showed a woman holding it in the palm of her hand. And of course, if this was a business school presentation, that would kind of be the end of the story. Company manager at a company has a vision, company throws lots of resources at it, engineers work day and night feverishly solving all kinds of problems, and voila, it rains money because nobody can keep them on the shelves anywhere in the world. But this is not a talk at the business school. This is a talk at the Carr Center. And one of the interesting things about this technology is it had no mute button. In that rapid, fast pace to build it, they had forgot to put a mute button on it. And in fact, in Japan, who had different rules about recording photographs in public was the same as in America, meaning you could photograph people in public. But where the difference was recording a person's conversation. In the United States, you need consent. In Japan, you didn't. And with no mute button, there was no way people in the United States could make that distinction. And right away, people started going to jail. There was a mother who strapped one of those to her child on a school bus, and it caused and the video captured various atrocities in speech from the bus driver and from one of the teachers. She takes the video recording down to the police station, and they arrest her for illegal wiretapping. There was a protest in the Boston area at Boston University, and a bystander on the sidewalk had one of the cameras and was recording the police arresting a protester. The police stopped arresting the protester, they turned around and they arrested the bystander with the camera. He faced 7 years in prison. Now we fast forward to today. The ACLU fought the case of the bystander and won us all the right to record the police in the service of their duties in public here in the United States. And Pennsylvania passed a law requiring a video and audio recording on all school buses. Now, it may have been the case that American society would have evolved to those same decisions anyway. But it's not okay that it got there because some designer forgot a mute button, something that would have cost the company a fraction of a penny. It's not okay that people had to suffer and risk criminal penalties and so forth just because it didn't have a mute button. And what's interesting about technology design is when something is successful in the marketplace, its design gets replicated without question. Today, most of us record video on a mobile phone or a smartphone. And those same recordings, they don't have a mute button either, even though now it would just be a matter of a software update. I show you this story because it becomes really clear that technology designers are the new policymakers. We don't know them, we don't elect them, but the arbitrary decisions they make in the technologies we use dictate the rules we live by. The Sony camcorder was to have many of these kinds of conflicts in their design. In 1998, it added a feature called Night Shot, which the idea was in very low light, it could in fact capture amazing images of animals or even of people on a subway stop. But the camera had this weird effect that if you use the camera with Night Shot during the bright light of day or in internal well-lit rooms, it had an X-ray kind of capability that removes people's clothing. You could sort of see their body parts and you could see tattoos and so forth in their skin. And in this particular instance, it wasn't going to be American society that was going to have to adjust. It was somewhat such an egregious situation that the company ended up forking over just a crazy amount of money to do a recall on these devices that didn't work very well. So here we have yet another technology society clash with the camcorder, one this time that cost the company money. But it also gives us another lesson around how technology design and technology works in the marketplace. In 2020, OnePlus, which is a Chinese company, also produced a camera. Also produced a phone with a camera, and that phone also had its version of Night Shot, and it had exactly the same problem that the Sony camcorder had decades earlier. That is, when you took a photograph of someone who was clothed in public, it had this X-ray ability to see beneath their clothes. But the difference, of course, was easy. It didn't cost OnePlus nearly as much money or as much bad press because OnePlus just used a software update, giving us a sense of how technology is changing, both for options for remedies to some of these clashes, but also the undisputable nature that the design of the technology dictates how we live. So I give this a new definition. I want to introduce it to you today. I want to give you examples of why I make the case we live in a technocracy. And I'd like to talk about the work that our students are doing and that the lab is doing to help us find our way back. So technocracy is not a new term, it's an old term. It usually means that the government or control of society, basically by technical experts, people who are experts in an area. Where we see this in the United States most often are things like there are just certain jobs that only a lawyer can have, or certain jobs only an economist can hold in the government. And what I mean by this new model, though, is the government or control of society through the design of technology. And I want to pose to you that we live in a technocracy. So I'll tell you, I started my academic career at MIT as a graduate student in computer science. And back then, you knew this revolution was coming. You could see it coming. And in the idealism of my youth and in the hopes of what I saw as a computer science graduate student, to me, it just seemed like the promise of a better tomorrow, a future that will lead us to a better democracy. After all, technology would be cheap. It was going to transform everything, and it wouldn't have bias or introduce other kinds of harms to individuals. And so one day, in this sort of zeal of the future existence that I lived in, I was walking through one of the lounges to get a cup of coffee, and I ran into an ethicist, Beverly Woodward at Brandeis University. And she was talking to someone else, but I heard her say computers are evil. So I stopped to correct her thinking. Didn't she know about the beautiful world that we were about to inherit? And she and I began a conversation, and eventually I wanted an example. And the example that she chose was an example of health data that had been acquired on state employees, their families, and retirees. A copy had been given to researchers, and another copy had been sold to industry. And I talked about that's amazing because today we have computing power that could actually help us find correlations with diseases and give hypotheses about new ways and new ways for treatment, but also new kinds of ways of how do we think about living with these diseases and perhaps save money and so forth. And she said, yeah, that's true if the data really are anonymous. And so the circle that you see on the left is an example, has the fields that pretty much were in that health data, diagnosis codes, procedure codes. When the people visited the hospital, it did not have name or address or social security number, but it did have month, day, and year of birth, gender, and there were 2 genders in the data set, and the 5-digit zip code. So I do a quick calculation in my head. There are 365 days in a year. Let's say people live 100 years and 2 genders. When you multiply that out, it's 73,000 possible combinations. But I happen to know the typical 5-digit zip code in Massachusetts only had 25,000 people. That meant that date of birth, gender, and 5-digit zip code would be unique for most people. So my argument is falling apart now with my little anecdotal calculation. And I wanted to know if it were true. So I go to City Hall here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I purchased the Cambridge voter list. And the reason I did that was William Weld was the governor of Massachusetts at that time. He had collapsed in public, and not a lot was known about why he had collapsed. The information about that collapse was in that health data. He lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in fact, when I acquired the data, it was really clear. 6 people had his date of birth. Only 3 of them were men, and he was the only one in his 5-digit zip code. That meant that date of birth, gender, and zip code were unique for William Weld in the voter data, and also unique for him in the health data, which meant I could put his name to his health data. And we find ourselves at this amazing crossroads because while the health data is being shared under a new technology empowerment where people could use data in a way that they couldn't use before to answer questions and so forth, at the same time, there's some data we have to make public. In an election, who you vote for is private information, but that you were eligible to vote, that you did vote is public information in order for the democracy to be strong. And so here we had this amazing conflict. I used 1990 census data, built a model, and estimated that this same issue, that is month, day, year of birth, along with gender and 5-digit zip code, was unique for the majority of people in the United States, 87%. So one day I'm a graduate student doing these calculations, having this discussion with an ethicist. About a month and a half later, I'm down in Washington, D.C. testifying about what this experiment became known as the Weld experiment. It's actually, and within months, laws around the world would change. Why? Because there wasn't just that one health data that was shared that way. That was the best practice around the world. And laws around the world had to change now because technology has sort of changed the calculus of anonymity of individual privacy. That experiment is also cited here in the United States. We were in the middle of debating what became known as the HIPAA privacy rule, and that example is included in the preamble of it. It was to go on to launch a whole field in computer science called data privacy. And it's been an amazing journey. It's sort of the first sort of technology society clash. And notice it really wasn't rocket science. It was really a simple experiment of just observing and quantifying. And the time that was to come, the decades that was come after the Weld experiment, was characterized by just tremendous movement in data. Almost every time we had a problem that came up, the answer was a new data set. Data were just collected on individuals in mass. A couple of years ago, we took some students and we began to document here, now that it's so many years, almost a decade at the time we did this, after the passage of HIPAA, what happens where people's health data may go. So this is a plot. It's you can see it at the datamap.org of all the typical places a typical person's health data might go. And what's really interesting is how many of those flows aren't covered by any law at all. It's whatever you agree to or whatever the person agrees to on a click-through agreement, which means even something like HIPAA, informed by the change in technology, still left data privacy up for grabs. This idea of doing a simple experiment and having 1,000 great minds follow was to happen to me a second time. The second time it happened is when I became a faculty member here at Harvard. I was giving a interview with a reporter, and I went to type in my name into the Google search bar to show the reporter a particular paper. And then up did pop links for the paper. And the reporter says, don't tell me about, I'm not interested in that paper. Tell me about the time you were arrested. And I'm saying, what are you talking about when I was arrested? And he says, well, that's what your computer is saying. And he's pointing to an ad. That particular ad he pointed to said, LaTanya Sweeney arrested. And the question was, why did these ads show up? Why was this ad show up? And he was a very aggressive reporter in that he said, well, did Harvard know you had been arrested at the time they hired you? Did you plead guilty or innocent? And I kept telling him, I've never been arrested. So eventually I clicked the link. I pay $89 to Instant Checkmate, and it's a data broker repository. They have clearly what seems like every adult American, or every adult living in the United States, I should say, in their repository. They had a LaTanya Sweeney, only one, and there was no arrest record. But the question was, why did this happen? So I took a few months, I ran an experiment and did thousands of lookups on real names. And one thing that became really clear early on, even before I started doing the larger scale experiment, while the reporter was there, he and I spent a couple of hours trying to figure this out. And we noticed that other names started implying they had arrests too. In fact, if you said like LaTanya, you would see them. But if you had other names like Jill Christopher or Brett Langley, you saw these sort of neutral ads like, do you want to find more information? And the question is, what makes the difference? One thing was really clear, though. These ads only showed up on the first. You had to give a search that had both the first and last name. If you gave only a first name or a last name, or if you made up a name for which there didn't necessarily appear to be a person, you wouldn't see these ads at all. And so eventually the reporter, who is an Italian American, says, I got it, he says. It's because you got one of those black sounding first names. And I look at him and talk about, what do you know about a black sounding first name? But then I type LaTanya into the Google search bar, and up pops all these black faces looking back at me. And I type Tanya into the Google search bar, and up pops all these pale faces looking back at me, and you realize that there are some names given more often to Black babies than white babies. And somehow this algorithm or these ads were distinguishing it, even though there, like in the case of LaTanya Farrell, was no arrest record for her, or in the case of Kristen Lynch, who only got neutral ads, there was at least one Kristen Lynch who in fact did have a criminal record. Now, what's interesting, and so I do thousands of these lookups with real names and using a VPN around the country. And what I learned is that if your name is given more often to a Black baby than a white baby, these ads were likely to come up 80% more often for you and 20% for the other. Now, what's interesting about that, discrimination in the United States is not illegal. But what is illegal are certain groups under certain situations. One of those groups is Blacks, and one of those situations is employment. So if I have two people, Ebony and Jill, and they're both in running for the same job, and the potential employer types in Ebony's name into the Google search bar, and up pops an ad implying she has an arrest record. And the potential employer types Jill's name into the Google search bar, and up pops a neutral ad, then that's a disparate impact, meaning that that's illegal in the United States, especially if it's done systematically at scale. And the way that the US Department of Justice determines whether it's systematic and at scale is it an 80-20 split or worse? And here we had this algorithm. It was the first time an algorithm, in this case, Google's ad search, was found to actually warrant an investigation as a violation of the Civil Rights Act. So why did this happen? Well, Google search is delivering thousands of ads in a fraction of a second, and the companies are bidding for that ad space on that web page. And while that web page is loading, this auction happens, and the auction determines which bid will be answered. A bid looks like this. The company had literally placed a bid on the first and last name of almost every adult who lives in the United States. And then they claimed they gave 5 ad copies, 3 implying the person had an arrest and 2 implying they were neutral. And Google gets paid, the algorithm gets rewarded when somebody actually clicks. So what this bid is saying, that if somebody does a search on Ebony Glover and they click it, the company will pay Google 99 cents. And so the question is, why would this be happening? And so we can think of this technology as sort of a black box and allow ourselves to say, well, let's suppose it's not the algorithm. Let's suppose it's someplace else. Where could it be? Well, the bias could be in the setup data. It could be it's not true that 3 of them were implied arrest and 2 were neutral. On different names, they had different mixes of these ads. That could be one explanation. Another explanation that's interesting is that because the more you click on a particular version of an ad, the more likely the algorithm will deliver that ad, because it's trying to optimize its income. So if that's the one that you're clicking on, it's going to deliver that ad more often than the others. And what's interesting about it is, all I know is I could sit there and measure the adverse impact without knowing at the time which one was the problem, but that in fact there was a problem. And so a few years later, I was to become the chief technology officer at the at the Federal Trade Commission, which is kind of like the de facto police department of these companies, because so many of them are American companies. And even though that work had shown how the US Civil Rights Act was a problem, it's not as though the Department of Justice has a team even today that's looking for that. And one of the things I learned when I was at the Federal Trade Commission is that we have some amazing regulators. And in the case of the FTC, they're absolutely fearless. And if the American people really knew how hard they fight for Americans, would be just consider them superheroes. But the problem is they know how to do that in brick and mortar buildings. They don't know how to do that in an online world, in a network society. And so this problem means that increasingly more and more of the hard-fought rules that we live by are up for grabs. I'll give you a couple more examples. This is an example that came from Alvaro Bedoya and myself. We used to do a tag team talk going around to civil society organizations, explaining around this issue of what this algorithmic bias problem would really mean in terms of the rules and laws that individual civil society organizations cared about. So what you see here, at the time, there was no company that did this. Now, of course, there are lots of companies that do this. And this is a company who has a large bank of resumes, and they want to offer a new service. And that new service is to potential employers. They will offer up who they think is the best candidates out of this big pool of potential employees, potential applicants. And so the potential employer gets this list and says, hey, I like these guys, I don't like these guys. And what's happening now is it's a closed loop. So any algorithm worth its salt will learn the preferences of the company. And after a while, this will be what the pool will look like. Because in that particular case, the employer had a preference for young people, not old people, or older people, I should say. And so when we look at where is the problem coming from, this time we see it really is a bias in the external interactions. But this time we can't be, I don't have the ability to measure it because it's a relationship happening between the company or the algorithm and the company that wants to do the hiring. But either way, equal employment is up for grabs. Recidivism, one of the places that these algorithms is used really heavily is in the criminal justice system. In fact, throughout the criminal justice system. This particular example I'll give you comes from a few years ago, and it's happening in Broward County, Florida. The Brisha Borden, she may not look like it in that photo, but at the time this is happening, she's 16 years old. She and another young woman are walking down the street. They see a little kid on a bicycle, a young teenager on a bicycle, and he leaves the bicycle in his front yard and goes into his house. They decide they're going to steal his bicycle. So the two girls grab the bicycle and they're starting to run off when a neighbor starts to yell and another neighbor calls the police. The two girls separate. Brisha runs right into the police that are just approaching. And so they arrest her. Vernon, on the other hand, is in jail for armed robbery. Now, recidivism means neither one of them have been found guilty, but they're both coming before a judge to determine what is going to be the conditions that they'll be under before their trial date. Meaning, can they be released on a bond? Can they be released without a bond? Can they not be released at all and need to stay in jail until their trial comes? And so this algorithm that they used in Broward County has put Brisha at a high risk of 8, meaning, oh my God, she's so dangerous to society. You don't even think about letting her out until after her trial. And Vernon, on the other hand, who had armed robbery offenses before and a grand theft, was also in for yet another armed robbery. He got a risk score of 3. It's so low that you shouldn't even ask for a bond for him. And so when we think about these disparities, where is this problem coming from? So the algorithm is dressed up in nice mathematical packaging and makes it seem as though it's innocent and not biased. But in reality, it trained on all of the ways in which judges had been making decisions in Broward County over decades. And what it really is doing is making the same kind of decisions that had been made before, only now it's just packaged in a technology. But still, the use of these algorithms throughout criminal justice means the entire criminal justice enterprise is up for grabs. I give one more of these examples and then I'll change the tenor a bit. This is Joy Bawani when she was a graduate student at MIT. And what she's looking at on the left is she's looking in the camera on her laptop. The problem is the camera doesn't see her face. In fact, because of her dark skin, it turns out it doesn't see her face until she puts a white mask in front. And so what you see on the right is the active appearance model triangulating to figure out where the eyes and nose and mouth are when she holds up the white mask. Joy was to go on to show that this problem was inherent in all of the face recognition systems at the time. And in fact, as the color of the skin goes from sort of what we would say is white skin to black skin, or as the gender goes from male towards female, the accuracy of these face recognition systems gets worse and worse. At first glance, you might think it may not be so bad that face recognition can't identify a dark-skinned woman. She would be freed from some of the uses, but she'd also be cut out of some of the benefits. But check out this. Autonomous vehicles have to see you. And if they don't know that you're a person that can move, you'll just get hit. So this idea of face recognition not working is a huge problem. It's also, I'm old enough to also know immediately when I saw the problem that Joy described to me, where that problem came from. It came from the training data. For almost a decade, NIST is the group in Washington, D.C. that is one of the groups that tries to inspire new technological innovations. And they often will do that through challenges. And every year they will produce a data set, and the school or company who had the best algorithm in doing face recognition for the data set that was released that year, would get more money, and their graduates would go on and get better jobs and so forth. But every year that data set was primarily white guys. And so over time, these algorithms overfit to that data. I could go on, and I have a story like this, an example for all of these just crazy number of US laws and policies that literally are being reauthorized, rewritten by what technology design allows or doesn't allow. We find ourselves in a situation where those who would protect us, regulators, judges, even civil society itself or journalists, don't even know how to do their work in this new environment, which just leaves it all open, which means every value is actually up for grabs. So I've given you twice I've explained times where I've had this crazy history of being early to see a clash, do a simple experiment that sheds a lot of light on what's happening. And this was to happen to me a third time. In 2016, I realized a couple of years earlier that even though this was incredibly impactful work, one, the amount of technology problems is bigger than one person can really deal with. And even though I ignite thousands of great minds to try to find remedies, there's just so many problems. But the other thing was, it wasn't rocket science to do these experiments. It was about understanding how to look for a problem and how to do a simple experiment that would put a scientific fact that people could understand. And that I could teach students to do this. So when I came back from the Federal Trade Commission, we started a new undergraduate program here at Harvard called Technology Science. And students came from all kinds of disciplines, and we would go through these problems together. We'd take a few each year. The students call it the Save the World class, because we would literally try to save the world or do one of these enlightening experiments. And then it would get picked up by regulators and journalists. And I'll talk about some of the amazing things that the students have done as well in just a minute. But in 2016, the students and I decided we were going to follow the 2016 election. What were the ways in which technology could rewrite or change the way our policies work? And so one of the first things that we found was misinformation around polling places. We ended up building a web service, Vote GPS, that no matter where you lived in the United States would give you your accurate place to go to your polling place. And we followed the primaries right before the primaries and the primary seasons to make sure each state knew it. But by November, Google had replaced it with a system that had a card that when you typed it into the Google search bar, that card would pop up with your voting information. So that was one great one. Around March, though, we began identifying what we called persona bots. And this is an example on Twitter. Now, there was a lot of commotion in 2016 about bots on Twitter. These were bots that were tweeting at speeds faster than humans could possibly do and sort of drowning out the ecosystem. But those aren't the bots that we're talking about. The bots we're talking about, well, they look like a real person. They have a realistic name, a realistic photo. And notice these stats. They're not, they're followed by a few people, and they follow their followers. And they have a political purpose. And for the most part, they don't tweet very much. They either retweet something a follower provided, but otherwise, every once in a while, they'll do a firsthand tweet. But the firsthand tweet, if you click on the link, goes to a very professional grade website that promotes the same mis or disinformation. And so we began calling these persona bots. We found thousands of them. We reported them to the attorneys at Twitter. They took down thousands of those accounts. Some of them are still there. And later we found out from national security that it was a state actor, in this case Russia, that they felt was behind this. Then as June came, a really weird thing happened in California's primary in 2016 in Riverside County. This guy is the attorney general, the district attorney in Riverside County. On the day of their primary, he gets tons and tons of phone calls. He ends up taking the police and they start going to polling places. What's happening is that in California has what's called a closed primary. What that means is that if you're a registered Democrat, when you come in for the primary, you get a Democrat ballot. If you're a registered Republican, you get a Republican ballot. But what was happening on this particular day was Republicans were walking in and they would get anything but a Republican ballot. They would get a Democrat ballot or a Libertarian ballot or Green Party ballot. And what that meant was that they were being disenfranchised and was not going to be able to participate in who the Republican winner of the primary would be for California. What they found out is someone had gone onto the website and changed the party affiliation of those voters. And we began asking ourselves, well, wait a second, maybe that was a dry run for something that could be done at a national scale. And if it was done across the entire state, you could shave a few percentage points off of an election by disenfranchising a voter simply by changing their address without their knowledge. They would show up at the polling place where they always go, and they wouldn't be on the record. And they'd start yelling and screaming, so the election official will give them a ballot. So they'll stop yelling and screaming and think they voted, except when they turn in their ballot, it's put on the side. It's called a provisional ballot, and in most states it doesn't count, or it doesn't count fully. Which means that if you did this at large and you distribute it across a state, you could shave off 1 to 5% of the election results on one side or the other. And in 2016, some states were decided within that margin. In order to do that, we showed you could do it for those 35 states that were just highlighted. For all of them, shaving off a few percentage points for only $9,000. That's all it would take, which included the computational costs. So we'll talk about what became of that problem, but it gives you a sense of the kind of issues that technology is sort of hitting us up all the time. And this problem is still here. So we've invented some technology to try to help. Voteflare will talk about it. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't talk about the latest of this technology revolution, and that would be generative AI. I mean, obviously, here it is 2024. Students, some of my students are following the 2024 use of generative AI in the election and other kinds of things. But generative AI is definitely kind of a revolution within this revolution for sure. For example, I asked it to write me a quick rap song about Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights, and it's kind of cute if you think about it. Similarly, this is the face of a person that doesn't exist. All I said was make a face image, or the image on the right I said, make an image of Harvard libraries during finals. Harvard has many beautiful libraries. That one could look like it could be here. It's not actually a Harvard library. It was made up. But the things that this system can do, including make up stories, complete with images, is pretty stunning. And I should just give you a little sense of how it works and how it leans into broader issues that we'll probably be talking about for a couple of years around harms and risks. But the way this thing works is you take a statistical vacuum, and all it wants to do is figure out, you're just going to give it tons and tons and tons of data, and it's going to figure out for its own what makes a chunk and what are the weights to put on relationship of one chunk of data to another. In the case of something the popular ChatGPT, that training data has been the open internet. Pretty much anything you could find in a search engine, anything you could find publicly available on Google Docs, anything you could find in publicly available databases, all of that went into the training of ChatGPT. And so the idea is you provide a prompt, and what that prompt does is it allows you to change the weight on those chunks of information, and it gives it a focus of what do you want me to do? And then it produces a sort of a stochastic output based on it. And we've had examples of stochastic output, like many of us on our phone, you will type in something and it tries to complete what it thinks or predict what it thinks is the next word you want. This is the same technology, but this being done at a much larger scale. One of the things that's a little scary about these large language models like ChatGPT that learn on the open internet is that our students studied them last year and just gave crazy number of examples of why it's one of the most racist, sexist, xenophobic content you could have ever imagined. It's clearly a reflection of the state of our internet. It's so bad, in fact, that the company OpenAI has a filter, and its job as the filter is to not let that out. And it gives us a sense of also a study of what is the state of the internet and our well-being. But it also gives us a sense of limitations on what kind of conversation we're likely to see in the internet as we go forward. And what I mean by that is right now, good or bad, most of the content on the internet is made by humans. In 3 years, I will predict that most of the content on the internet will be made by bots and will live in a kind of echo chamber. So I hope I've convinced you that we do live in a technocracy. I just want to take 2 minutes. I do want to allow some time for question and answer, but I would be remiss if I don't tell you that we do teach students how to find these issues, how to document them, but also how to solve them. And how you go about solving them depends on where you can intervene in the technology lifecycle. If you work for a company that's building the technology, then we have different tools during the vision and development and commercialization stages. And we have a different set if it's in the marketplace. I won't talk about what these tools are in the details. We also have a journal that we produce to help promote this kind of work around public interest technology or technology. It's called technology science. And then we use these findings, we put them in front of regulators, civil society organizations. And so I just want to give you a sense of the work the students have done and the huge impact they've had in changing laws and regulations and business practices at the big tech companies. This is the work done by 3 students. What they were able to show is earlier, a faculty member had shown that Black hosts and white hosts in New York City, both of whom are offering Airbnb properties, didn't get paid the same. Black hosts made about 12% less. The students replicated and enriched the study and looked at Oakland and Berkeley, California, and they found that Asian hosts made about 20% less than white hosts. Airbnb came out and visited us, and then they changed the platform. Today, if you go to Airbnb and you make a booking, Airbnb itself sets the price in order to get around this problem. This is another project by Max Weiss. This particular one, he showed how projects, this is a couple of years ago in 2019, he basically says, hey, better watch out for that ChatGPT, because he used it in public comment servers to distort what regulators or even what politicians might think is public opinion. The short way to think about this is today, a politician, yesteryear, a politician, if they got 1,000 letters in favor of a particular bill, they could look at it, and if the wording was the same on the 1,000 of bills, they would know somebody's running a campaign. If the wording is different, they think it's 1,000 different constituents who have that particular opinion. ChatGPT makes it like 1,000 different participants. He showed this was true on federal public comment servers, and then there was a Senate hearing, and afterwards they changed the way at least the public comment servers work. Similarly, Daniel Rothschild did some work of how do you find fraud online using Twitter, and fraud here is where people will spend large amounts of money in the search of that fraud, and he was able to build a tool that the FTC ended up using. I want to stop. I think we could talk about some of the other tools that we've built, but I think what I want to do is stop here so we get a chance for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Latanya. I'm turning over to Sarah. I just want to emphasize, forgot to say this earlier. The audience, of course, you're very much encouraged to put your questions in the chat, and we'll bring them in as best as we can. Sarah, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Latanya. I think I'll start with maybe what advice do you have for those looking to pivot their careers towards becoming more public interest technologists, and where they can have an impact? Like, you covered a lot of range of, is it in industry, academia, within government itself, and you've had, you know, examples and experiences in all of those. So would love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, in order to change society and sort of right our ship, we need everyone working where they are. We need the same notion of lenses and eyes in all of these areas. But most importantly, we need to shore up those people who would normally be our helpers. That would be government, it would be regulators, it would be civil society organizations. And like you said, and as we do, we also try to help the industry itself. That is, within these companies, if you want to ensure your technology is not going to be disruptive or risk being disrupted, then you want to make sure you think about these things beforehand and design around them. So there's room for everyone. In fact, the students come from all kinds of disciplines. It's another way of saying that there is no one discipline. This is not a computer science thing. It's not a social science thing. It's, you know, we've had students from the history of science who've done amazing work. The students' work that I did highlight in that short intro right there was actually from statistics and a pre-med student and so forth. So get engaged where you are.
Thanks.
So in terms of where you are, so first of all, let me say I was very intrigued to hear the William Weld story from you. So the story has become quite a legend among your colleagues. So I've actually heard that story from a number of other people, and you know, the work that you did on that. So this was such a stage-setting episode. So it is, people remember that, and they love telling that story in terms of, you know, the power of these analyses. And what I wanted to ask you, so in terms of where you are, so 2024, big election year, all around the world, really, watershed year for democracy in so many ways. Are there any particular things in the United States beyond what you already covered that really worry you when it comes to November 24 in the United States?
I have nothing but worries for 2024. I have worries because, I told you what we did in 2016. Every problem we talked about, the polling place misinformation, the bots, and so forth, all of those things are still problems. In 2020, we received the leaked Facebook documents. a couple of years ago, and they cover the 2020 election. That is, these were documents, around 1,000 of them, leaked by Frances Haugen, who was the head of their civic integrity unit at Facebook. And what's really documented in there is what's going on at Facebook behind the scenes during the 2020 election. And you realize that there's just tons of things that Facebook doesn't know how to do. And it's not just them. Companies, social media, as a computer scientist, we don't know how to do trust at scale. We don't know how to do content moderation at scale reliably and so forth. And so here you've got this company trying to deal with all these issues. None of the problems that they talked about have been resolved either. And now we go into 2024, we've got generative AI. I can have a chat bot talk to me as if it's Barack Obama, complete with a voice that will sound like him. I can engage in conversations that will try to change my opinion on a particular topic, aimed at a level of persuasion that we haven't seen before. We've got deep fakes, the ability that my human eye can't determine whether it's a fake or whether it's real. And it might fuel into something I'd like to believe anyway, even if it's not true. All of this is leading towards, and at the same time, the social media platforms have decided they're coming out of the content moderation business when it comes to politics. So whatever they did in 2020, good or bad, they're doing less of it now. And they're just saying that straight up. So should we be, and at the same time, there's very little conversation around 2024. You just don't hear the concern. And maybe it's because here in the United States, people haven't begun to really focus on the election more intently. But it is, we're very worried. So we are kind of like we did in 2016, following the 2024 election, offering some band-aids for things that we know are problems, and trying to monitor and experiment in new areas for where problems may exist. And like
Another question. Oh, yeah.
I was just gonna say, in the Facebook documents, you also get a sense of Facebook's hand in all of these big, huge election issues that happened in 2016. You get a sense that it's not just the United States, and as you pointed out, this is a huge election year around the world.
Another question is, I think a lot of the advances in generative AI have really put a spotlight actually on some of the training data that goes into these models. So you have the big OpenAI New York Times lawsuit, Reddit selling user data for millions of dollars, which I'm sure is right up your alley as someone who focuses on this entire area. And I'll tie in one of the audience questions, which is, Casey is mentioning, I'm curious what you see as promising structural remedies to, very biased kind of training data, and a certain leaning like technology, the tech development industry being very white and male, right? Are there particular barriers for women and people of color you see as key to addressing this disparity? And then maybe at, even broader scale, like the kind of training data question, especially around generative AI, and the inputs into these systems. I think it'd be great to get your take on.
Yeah, well, I'll kind of think that's a lot actually, but I'll take them in reverse. And I'll take them in reverse for a couple of realizations to where the talk started. So if you just think about it for a moment, design decisions around technology, there's tons and tons of little decisions that people are making, that these technologists are making, that they just have to just kind of make. They're not really thinking or have even necessarily the time to weigh consequences. So that's why in the middle of making the camcorder, we end up with no mute button, because Kono and the other parts of his team were just too busy trying to get the technology right to just think about, wait a second, there are going to be places where we need a mute button. And similarly, if you just think about who would have known about discrimination in online ads if it hadn't been for a Black woman being more sensitive around, why is this ad showing I have an arrest record happening? Or Joy Bawani looking at a face detection algorithm and it doesn't see her. If the diversity isn't in their space, isn't in the room, it's yet another failure point for these technologies. And so those are two reasons why these things are important, but it's not just who's in the room, but also how we might think about when a technology is okay. You know, when I said, look, we're in the third industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution also brought us consumer protection. It also brought us things like underwriters' laboratories. So yes, electricity becomes a new thing. I buy a new electrical device, I plug it into my home's outlet, and the thing blows up in my hand. Or I plug it in and it sets fire to my home. And so what did we want? What did we do? Well, one of the ways we dealt with that is we have now if you look at some thing you plug in, it has a UL usually imprinted on it for underwriters laboratory, meaning somebody tested that thing and made sure that it's safe to use. And so we may see in some of these technologies something like that. I do think we'll see remakes of some of the kinds of remedies we saw from the Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution, sort of make sort of a new version of them. There's no one answer that's going to solve this because the space of change is pretty much every aspect of our lives. So there's no one remedy to this problem. People are auditing algorithms and coming up with other ways of saying, is this algorithm okay for this purpose? And that's really important. Or don't I need to know what data it was trained on? Can I test that data to see if it's okay or viable? So it's a full spectrum. I mean, that's a talk all by itself, but I wanted to just give you a sense of the space.
So we are unfortunately out of time. Let me say one thing, since this came up in a couple of questions in the Q&A. So of course the content, the webinars in the series are always also on the Carr Center YouTube channel, and this was an amazingly information-rich talk with just a lot of stuff that's highly relevant, pertinent to what's happening in the world right now. So the YouTube channel obviously also serves as a kind of archive for this material. So if you want to go back to this material, it's all there. Tanya, we are incredibly grateful, first of all, for this work that you are doing, you know, William Weld and way beyond by now, and incredibly important that just to make sure that technology, the amazing humans can do with technology, actually put to the good kind of use, so that the vision that you had when you were in graduate school about technology being made to make the world really a better place, that actually comes true. So thank you for that work, and thank you for bringing so many people into this work, and thank you also for being with us today and sharing some of us with our audience here. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care, everybody.